Hey guys, so today you and I are going to talk about small increments. So let's get into it. So the question in question was, Frederick, what are the advantages in your opinion when if building software in small increments? Of building software in small increments. Well, usually the biggest benefit is that the scope of what you're doing is smaller. The thing that you do when you do that is usually that you trade the the scope of whatever you're doing for depending now how your delivery process looks like, but it's usually that you trade it for overhead because it usually takes longer, slightly longer depending on how you do it, to ship in smaller increments. It's not always 100% sure because you can, depending on how big the scope is, well, you can safely cut some corners. So an example would be if you sit on a very big story, let's say that you work on that story for days and days and days and you touch a lot of code. Now, when you do that, when you put that up for code review, it becomes very difficult for the code reviewers to read all that code and understand sort of the whole scope of the thing. And so the likelihood is actually that they are going to start doing the thing that a lot of developers do, which is to skip things and just sort of check stuff, because different people have different capacity for concentration, and they may not do a good job if there's too much code to review. And then the next thing happens, even if they, let's just say for the sake of argument that they did a good job, then the next thing happens, which is that you need to validate or verify somehow that this feature works. And the more code that you have changed, the more likely it is that you have broken something or something hasn't been tested properly, because when the scope is really big, the testing also becomes a little bit more complicated, because as you can imagine, if you change something on one page, it's easier to test that one page than if you change something on 10 pages or something that has an effect on 10 pages. And so the advantage of building in smaller increments is that you can scope things down to the smallest possible thing that is possible to ship, or as I like to say, the smallest valuable thing that you can ship. You don't even have to always ship something that is working. It really depends on how you want to go about this. So the way that I usually try to think about this stuff, if I'm going to give you, this is really tricky for me because it's sort of like it's just my own mental picture of how I do things, and that is that I think in terms of I try to think about the way I ship code as a topological tree, if that makes sense. Like, so I need to ship one thing to ship another thing to ship another thing to ship another thing, or to unblock three other things, etc., etc. So there's always a cadence or something like that, like a hierarchy. And so when I first ship something, my goal is to do the first and foremost thing, and that is I identify, if I ship this thing now, what does it unblock? Now I've made a few videos about this where I try to explain that the reason why, let's say if I do make a full stack web application or something like that, I always try to ship the UI first. The reason why I try to ship the UI first, unless like the backend is very simple or like it's more effective to just ship the whole thing, is because it unblocks something, and the thing it unblocks is early feedback. The reason why it does that is because if I ship a proof of like a UI where I just hard code some data in the UI and then I ship that to the user or to the customer, then they can play around with it if they so desire. Like they can test it, etc., etc. It's still the same work I would have had to do but it's just that now they get access earlier. And the benefit of giving them access earlier, I hope that is fairly intuitive. They can play around. If it's something that is missing or something like that, then they can give me feedback early, and in many cases they don't even care. But I haven't lost any time in doing so, but I also get testing and like these sorts of benefits. and then I can do the backend, for example. That's one way of splitting it, but you can do the same thing in basically anything. I mean, if an example would be if you're creating an entire API, then shipping one API endpoint and pulling that into production is easier and smaller of a scope than shipping 10 endpoints or stuff like that, etc. So getting into that sort of way of thinking has, at least for me, been very helpful, because it allows me to take one step in the right direction, look around, see if there's something that changed when I took that step. It's what we call MVP, basically. And then take the next step instead of taking these very, very big leaps. And the reality is usually that if you do it correctly, there's almost no difference in terms of scope. Like you think, and a lot of people do, if they feel as if this is slower because you have to retest things over and over, when the reality is that, sure, depending on how you do it, if you do it in an ineffective manner, yes, then you might have to test a little bit more, but it's also a more qualitative approach, which we sort of try to push as the idea, right? But as I was saying with the other scenario, the thing that's actually happening is that you're trading risk of how much testing, or like how likely are you to miss something. So when you take these bigger leaps, or like when you code a lot or you do larger increments, as I said, it's really the idea that you're losing that you're gaining time because you can do less testing is sort of, yeah, I hope that makes sense to people. Like it's really down to how do you want to do stuff. Because if you're not testing as much and you can ship faster in larger increments, sure, you deliver faster, but the likelihood of you having bugs and so forth is also higher, which is a favorite of mine. No one ever counts the time it takes to fix bugs with their code into how long did it take to ship this feature. It's something for a lot of people that is very unintuitive. So what I want you to take away from this is that the advantage of building software in small increments is that you can ship things earlier. If you think of it this way, guys, if you're gonna build a company or something like that, if you're going to build yourself a gigantic corporation or something like that, the first thing you would want to do is to establish some type of net revenue stream, right? So you might start, a juice shop or like an ice cream stand or something like that to just get some money rolling, and then you increment and you actually build something bigger. You might be establishing a full-fledged company, etc., etc. Or if you're in a survival situation, well, the first thing you want is water, fire, etc., etc. So maybe the first thing isn't to start breaking out iron ore and trying to make yourself a forge of some sort. First thing is to maybe get yourself a little cup that you can catch rainwater in. That's the small increment idea, because if you take the thing that is going to give you value as quickly as possible, you actually get some benefit from it very early on, and as long as it's going to flow into the next feature. That's the thing that a lot of people, I argue, get wrong with MVP, and that is that they mistake MVP for shitty code, which it shouldn't mean. It's not. You're not making a hackathon project. You're making a serious product. It's just that you're focusing on building something useful that is going to then be iterated on, and the next step is going to be increasing like the functionality or whatever. And if you can get that right, I've always found this to be a very effective way of working. It just it requires a bit of practice and adjustment, but it does work really well. The downside is, as I said, it can take a little bit longer in terms of testing and overhead, and might have to run extra pipelines. But the reality is, guys, most of the people that I talk to that have issues with everything, the pipeline has to run an extra time, etc., etc., and I have coworkers like that. It's the same people who don't believe in snapshot testing, etc. The only argument they ever have comes down to one root thing, and that is that they are lazy. Usually they're lazy people. They don't like doing things that feels like it takes extra time, etc., etc. And it is a valid argument that things take extra time, but I've never really been the sort of person who feel like you can't solve that problem, or that it's actually a really bad problem to deal with, because at the end of the day, if it doesn't work, the it doesn't work, and the code working is more important than most other things. Have a great day.